take this, kind of blow it up a little bit, your immediate reaction is to look at this and start to draw, right? Start to go, okay, well, let me draw the eyes, right? Let me go ahead and then build that out. Let me do the nose, right? Let me start to build the rest. And we're picking details, right? We're picking details like the eye, maybe the gills, maybe the mouth, and we start to expand out when we're drawing these things. Now, we can grasp this section or the sections around the details pretty well. But let's not forget that we're trying to draw the whole thing, and we just have to be off a little bit here and there for the whole thing to not add up. So when we're doing studies, one approach that I highly encourage as one of the activities that you want to do, so it's not the only activity, but simply one of the activities that you want to do, is look at something like this and let's start to break it down into its primitive shapes, right? So if I'm looking at a shape like this, or this creature, essentially what I'm looking at is a series of cylinders or conical forms. So when I'm drawing this, the very first thing that I want to do is obviously, we want to draw it relatively as is, that we copy the camera angle, right? But rather than just copying what we see, let's try and break this down. So I'm going to overall start outside in, so the big shapes first. So I'm doing this sort of big oval to try and help me understand the overall length of what it is I'm doing. The second part that I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start to create these cylinders, right? Because I'm trying to capture the overall shape and form of this shark, but I want to break it down into these geometric forms because it's much easier to deal with a cylinder or a cube than it is to deal with a more complex form, right? And I'm sketching this out. I'm trying to be very, very loose. Right? I'm not too worried about the overall sort of neatness of the drawing. The whole point of studies is that these aren't meant to be finished pieces of art. They exist for one reason and one reason alone, which is to help you understand something. Now, if they end up being really nice pieces and that you are comfortable sharing them or that you would like to share them, great, right? Go ahead and share them. But we have to understand that that's a side effect, or that's something that comes a little bit later on. In the beginning, what we're looking at is simply just to understand, right? We are studying. These drawings can be as messy as you would like, or they can be as clean as you would like. Right? Nobody is really going to see this except you. Now, my recommendation is always make them messy. Right? Try not to be precious with your drawings. The more precious you are with your drawings, the slower or the longer it's going to take, and the less you're going to do. We want to do, in terms of studies, we want to do as much as we can. Right? It's kind of like if you're reading. You don't just want to read one book, you want to read as many books as you can if you're trying to study a particular field, if you are trying to improve your vocabulary or whatever it might be. So I'm going through and I am approaching everything as if it is a blocky object. Right? And I'm using that initial sort of overall squiggle that I did to figure out how big I want this shark, and then once I'm inside, I actually start to divide this, and I'm approaching it as if it is made out of these sort of sectional parts. The other thing I'm doing is I'm by and large ignoring most of the perspective that I have in here, and I'm redrawing some of the elements in a brand new perspective, right? Because as I understand what the form is, if this is made out of blocky forms, as if it was like a wooden toy, as I understand what it is, I am now less beholden to the original source material, right? But I'm still keeping up roughly the same camera angle as what I see here, just to kind of help me along. Again, when we're doing these studies, when we're learning how to draw, or we're building our visual library, it's not about drawing exactly what you see, right? It's about trying to capture that form. It's about trying to understand what it is that you're drawing. And from a concept art point of view, and also from some other visual arts point of view, it is the form that is quite critical in helping, let's say, in our case, an audience be able to recognize what it is that they're looking at. It's got this sort of cut up here, so I'm just going to follow that through, right? And so I make sure that I have a little bit of a wider oval-like shape over here. Right. It is very simple. Let me rephrase. It is very easy with all the sort of the beautiful pieces that are online these days. Especially, you can get them from ArtStation or Pinterest or whatever, what have you. But it's very easy to kind of get a little bit sidetracked with that material, and you start to think that everything that we do has to be perfect. Everything that we do has to be a beautiful piece of art. Now, granted, that would be really cool, but we have to remember everything that we do, or some things that we do, they have a very specific purpose. And so long as they achieve that purpose, then you are getting what you want out of it. Right, so the same way that this is a study, so it's I'm being relatively crude with this. I'm really focusing on the big shapes right now. I'm not too worried about the details. So as I mentioned before, this is a study. I'm observing something and I'm drawing it. This is not meant to be a finished piece. It's almost, think about it like this. If you have a Ferrari, you're not going to use a Ferrari to till or plow a field, right? You're going to use the Ferrari to have a little bit of fun on a racetrack. Definitely not going to take it off-road like a rally car. And so the same thing with this. This is a study. Its first and primary goal is to allow you to understand what it is that you're drawing, and then learning from that. If it so happens to have a really awesome sort of visual outcome, that's great, but it's not its primary goal. Right, so I'm just going through, and some of the parts, some parts are connected, some parts aren't. I'm trying to create the overall look, the overall proportional and form build of my shark over here. And I'm not even dealing with transitions right now, because since a lot of these parts are separate from each other, there is no transition. Nothing is merging or blending in with anything else. All right, so in this case, what we're looking at, all these parts are very much separated out. They'll sort of cut in to create the eyes. So this is a direct translation of looking at our shark and reconstituting it as a blocky form. And just to emphasize it a little bit more, let me go ahead and I'm going to block out all these sort of intermediate faces. Because I want to show, or I want to really exaggerate visually the gaps in between, in that I'm trying to build this shark out of these conical or cylindrical forms. And I would do that with just about every animal or everything that I draw. If I'm trying to understand it for the first time, mind you, I think this is maybe the second time that I've drawn a shark. I did a shark once for one of my classes, but otherwise I'm not very familiar with drawing sharks. They don't really pop up in my work all that much, where I haven't been asked to do any sharks. So I am learning how to draw sharks as I'm doing this demo. Right. So I'd start with that, and that would be the very first step that I would personally do, which is to break this down and to look at it as geometric forms. And I'm really trying to stay relatively close to my original reference image as I can, without sacrificing some of the forms. The second version that I'll do, something that is a little bit more complicated, is that I'll take the same approach, and then I'll do the shark in a different perspective. Right, so this perspective, by and large, follows the image that we have. The second version, I'll take the same process of looking at these forms, and I'll start to draw it in a different perspective, just to just to reinforce the knowledge that I've gained from here about the overall form. What is that going to look like in a new or different perspective? So I've got a couple of guard lines down here and just to help with my perspective. So again, taking this knowledge, right, I actually do roughly the same thing as I did last time, which is I want to roughly map out how long I want this the shark to be, something a little bit like this. Probably rough out how wide I want it. Now there's no perspective tricks in this, there's no kind of doing foreshortening or anything like this. Right now I'm just gauging everything by eye because we are doing sketches, studies, we're doing observational drawing. So I want to, or at least my approach when I'm doing these observational drawings, is that I want to be able to do this stuff if I'm sitting at a cafe, if I'm outside, right, or if I'm just kind of on the couch, kind of watching some TV or something like that. I want to be able to do this in a very relaxed space where I don't have to worry too much about making sure everything is perfect, right? So I'm not doing any foreshortening, not doing anything like that. I'm really just looking at, okay, well, how can I kind of sketch this out, and how can I gauge things, judge things by eye? One of the skills that is important to develop is being able to train to have a pretty good eye to figure out if what you're drawing looks like what it's supposed to be, right? You can be as accurate as you can follow all the perspective rules, but if it comes down to it, in terms of if what you're drawing doesn't look right or doesn't look like what it's supposed to, then there's something fundamentally wrong or broken about the process that you're using. Right? So even if you are following all the perspective rules, everything, you are making sure that every line is going exactly where it's supposed to go and all that sort of stuff, we have to make sure that we still want to train our eyes so that we can make these micro adjustments when we're drawing things, right? Because you might follow all the perspective rules, you might have a grid, you might be doing everything very very correctly. I suppose that's probably a good way of wording it. But if it looks weird, then well, there's not much you can do about that. If it looks weird, it looks weird. And we have to develop an eye so that we can recognize when something looks weird or not. Now, I do apologize for constantly spinning my screen. When I'm drawing, I do spin my page around quite a bit because there's going to be some movements I find are very comfortable for me to make. Some movements are going to be a little bit trickier, so I will spin the page, in this case the canvas, I will spin it in a way that allows me to draw the lines that I want pretty comfortably. Again, when we're drawing in itself, it's supposed to be fun. Right? We might do this for work, and sometimes what you're being asked to draw may not be as fun, but overall this is meant to be, by and large, pretty enjoyable, which is why we do this line of work. It definitely doesn't get paid as much as some other lines of work, but the payoff, at least the payoff for us, is that we get to do stuff that is pretty enjoyable. Right? So part of making that enjoyable, or this process enjoyable, is the physical part of it needs to be pretty straightforward as well. We don't really want to hurt ourselves or have to put ourselves in sort of like contort ourselves in weird positions just about to draw something. If I'm looking at this, the dorsal fin is actually a little bit behind the center. I've got my center pegged about there, so I'm just going to put the dorsal fin a little bit towards the back. Angle that down a little bit. This sits the fin over here, the lateral fins. I don't know. I know that this is called a dorsal fin. I don't actually know what these are, apart from just being fins. I suppose maybe a lateral fin would be close to what they are, but I'm no marine biologist, so I'm kind of having to guess. And I'm just going to start to put the fins in. Now, of course, there is a little bit of I said there was no perspective, magic before perspective tricks or anything like that, but there is a little bit of it. Just coming in just so that I kind of figure out, like, okay, let's probably There's a fin running along there. There's probably going to be another one running back here on the other side. It's probably going to sit somewhere like this. Once you learn perspective, it's kind of it's actually really hard to draw stuff not in perspective once you are, once you get pretty familiar or used to drawing in perspective. So let's go through and start to cut those down. Now, I mentioned before that this is, sometimes this gets referred to as dynamic sketching. Now, I'm not too familiar with that term. That's something that I've heard from a lot of other people. But when I was learning a lot of this stuff, which I've kind of gathered, I suppose, is dynamic sketching, we just simply called it observational sketching, observational drawing, or studies. Right. But I quite like the term design sketch because it kind of gives it a little bit more purpose in terms of why are we drawing this, what are we trying to get out of it. Well, we're trying to understand the design of a particular animal or a particular thing, right? So I find calling a design sketch is something that rings a little truer to the purpose or the intent, right? And I suppose observational drawing is the same thing, or observational sketching kind of has the same sort of overall approach to it. All right, so here we have the second version of it. So I have one at the top, which is really following what I see here. And I have a second version below, which is very much about redrawing what I have up here in a fresh perspective. Now, I only have this one reference image to look at, right? So some of the things may be wrong. And this is where, as we do more studies, it will get better because we'll have more reference images that we can pull from. That's going to improve the quality of your work, or the quality and the fidelity of your studies, because you will build up more of a visual library. As you do more of these, you have more references that you can pull from in your mind that you've drawn from. And if there's ever a point where you're not entirely sure what to draw or what something looks like, just go online, find an image of it. We want to use references as much as we can. Right? Not using references is, it's really just laziness. I know some people might have this idea that, if you're using references, then you're cheating, or you're lesser of an artist or something. But in my opinion, if you're not using references, you're just being lazy. All right. So we have, as I mentioned again, our first iteration and our second iteration of this shark. And again, very loose, very rough, right? The whole idea is that we don't necessarily want these really clean drawings. What we want are these very dynamic, very lively sketches, and we want to do them relatively quickly. Now, I think for this particular one, this came in at about, if I'm looking at my timer and it's correct, it's about 8 minutes, right? And this one up here, I think was a little bit longer. I think it was like 11, 12 minutes or something like that. As a beginner, I think a good sort of time scale to give yourself is to maybe, give yourself maybe about 20, 30 minutes for these drawings, I think is a nice sort of time limit. And really just, we're not looking at details. Obviously, if I go in and I flesh this out a lot more, literally flesh this out, it's going to take me more time to draw it. What I'm looking at right now is to simply get these big shapes. Now, this is relatively flat. But if I look at this shark now, there's a little bit of a bend. There's a little bit of a bend that comes through that shark. And so what if I want to showcase that bend? So let me do a third version, which is a little bit more advanced. Again, we're looking at our shapes. I'm going to start to bend things. Right. And this time I'm actually drawing it from a downward angle. So it's a little bit more dramatic, and I'm going to try and capture most of this. Again, being very loose with my lines over here to try and capture the look and feel of the shark, the overall sort of the way that it might bend and compress one side of its body as it kind of turns. I'm using the knowledge that I gathered from up here, right? If I imagine that these are, let's say from the top, if I imagine that these sections are sections that are separated from each other, if they were to bend, we would get something a little bit like this. So that means that we're going to have one side that's going to be compressed, and we're going to have another side that is going to stretch, right? This part is going to stretch out, right? This part is going to stretch out as well. So I'm taking that knowledge, I'm looking at it in terms of just the shapes, almost as if these were made out of blocky parts. What would that be, right? How would I visualize that? All right, it's coming down, getting these shapes in. So right now this drawing, it's not really based on any references anymore in terms of not copying any particular camera. I'm taking the information that I've gathered from the previous drawings and I'm adapting it to what I need next. I'm still approaching everything, right, as blocky forms. This beautiful center line that runs across here for the shark. I definitely want to maintain that. The other thing that I'm trying to do when I'm drawing is I'm going for these rather bold lines. I'm not trying to do any sort of sketchy lines. I'm going for these big bold lines because right now, again, what I'm after is the forms. I'm not after details. Details are something that can come later, right? Details ultimately are actually not that important. We think they're important, but they're kind of useless at the end of the day. Details are not particularly useful. Because when you are trying to discern if something is a shark, I feel, or whatever design it might be, you tend to look at it from quite a distance. So if you see someone walking down the street, when they're walking towards you, you know that it's a person because of the big forms, right? The silhouette. You don't know, you don't recognize it as a person because you can see their face, right? So they're walking down, someone's walking down the street towards you, and they're 200-300 meters away. You can't see much of the facial features. What you do see is the silhouette. What you do see is the form that person, that character might have, the way that they walk, the way that they carry themselves, maybe the silhouette of the clothes that they wear. But you're certainly not going to see their face. You're certainly not going to see all the little details, pores and things like that, or even something like a nose or eyes. You're not really going to see any of that. So we focus on the big forms, because the little things like the details, they are ultimately not very important, and they tend to hinder what we're trying to achieve. It's not to say that details aren't important, but we need to know, we need to be aware that there's a time and place for them. So let's bring that across. Again, I'm just going to fill in the gaps I have in between, because again, I'm still treating these as blocky forms. And so I don't want to, I don't want to lose that, so I want to just exaggerate it. Because to put a skin over this and merge them together, it's pretty easy, right? It's pretty straightforward. I don't really need too much help with that. But to get that skeleton underneath, well, that part is hard. Just going to carve that in a little bit more. Let's bring this back. So the brush is a little bit too small. Let's bring this tail section up a little bit. That's that central part that runs down. I might connect there, curve around, and it runs through here. Let's go ahead and put in the tail, or the tail fin, sorry. And I keep forgetting that it does have these sort of additional, I don't know, I guess like support fins. I really don't know much about sharks. I should probably read up on it. Again, like I said before, there's no excuse of not knowing this stuff anymore. You just, run a Google search, read up on Wikipedia, and get quite a bit of information. Just want to make sure that that's running straight down the middle. I'm just going to have a little bit offset. This as well. It's really going to be some sort of fin here. Let's put it on the other side. And then we have this sort of lateral fin there. Let's put that there. Because we have that entire dorsal fin up here. I'm not sure we're going to really see too much of it. Maybe a little bit of poking up. And I almost forgot about the eye. So let's have a little bit of a cut to represent the eye that's getting notched in, as if it was kind of like it's a wooden toy, right? And you're kind of carving into it. What would you actually end up with? Let's widen this head out a little bit more. I was just losing a little bit before. Got a little bit overzealous with my blocking in. And so we have something like this, right? So a little bit opposite direction than I might want it, but we can see that a very first step of what we're looking at is, let's just look at what we have in front of us, and let's break it down into very, very basic geoforms, right? Very simple. We could even draw on top of this. The second step is, okay, well, let me try and redraw it in a different perspective, but we'll keep it nice and simple. So in this case, it's a very simple sort of three-quarter view, right? Again, taking the information that we have from both up here, feeding it down here, and also from our photograph, feeding in here in case we've missed anything. And then the next level to advance past that, as far as if you want to push your ability, is to go, okay, well, now that I've done that,